He was the wealthiest subject in the realm, a man who draped himself in cloth of gold so exorbitant that a single yard cost more than a whole village earned in a year, and whose private army was vast enough to make the crown tremble. With more castles than the king had palaces and ancient Plantagenet blood in his veins, his lineage was arguably purer than the upstart Tudors themselves. Yet on that fateful morning in 1521, Edward Stafford ascended the scaffold not for treason, but simply because he was too powerful for Henry VIII to tolerate. This execution symbolized the brutal clash between the medieval nobility and the terrifying absolutism of the Tudor dynasty. We must look back to the very beginning, tracing the deep-seated insecurities of the regime that felt compelled to shed his blood. When Henry VII seized the crown in 1485, his claim was viewed as fragile and illegitimate, a patchwork victory by a lucky adventurer rather than a rightful heir. Yet while the Tudors were considered upstarts, the remnants of the House of Plantagenet still lurked in the shadows with far purer claims to the throne. Among these ancient families, the House of Stafford shone the brightest, representing a dynasty that had ruled for centuries and possessing a lineage that far outstripped the new kings. Edward Stafford possessed an embarrassment of genealogical riches, making him a walking political weapon in a world where bloodline was currency. As a direct descendant of King Edward III and linked to the mighty John of Gaunt, his royal legitimacy was undeniable and dangerous. In the eyes of the law, should the fragile Tudor line fail to produce a male heir, Buckingham was not merely a candidate for the crown, he was arguably the rightful King of England. This immense birthright was his greatest glory, yet it served as a latent death sentence from the moment he drew his first breath. By simply existing, he represented a living, breathing alternative to the Tudor regime, a passive threat that kept the king awake at night. To Henry VIII, Stafford wasn't just a noble subject. He was a walking what-if, whose royal pedigree painted a permanent target on his back. Edward Stafford was born at Brecon Castle in Wales on February 3, 1478. The location is significant. Brecon wasn't just a home, it was a fortress in the wild, militarized zone of the Welsh marches. The Staffords were marcher lords, quasi-kings who ruled these borderlands with their own laws, their own courts, and their own armies. His parents were the ultimate power couple of the late 15th century. His father was Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham, a man of immense ambition, volatility, and pride. His mother was Catherine Woodville. Pause on that name, Woodville. Catherine was the sister of the Queen of England, Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of King Edward IV. This meant that from birth, little Edward Stafford was the nephew of the king and queen. He was first cousin to the princes in the Tower. He was born at the absolute apex of the socio-political pyramid. The first 5 years of Edward's life were a golden haze of privilege. He was the heir to a dukedom that controlled vast swathes of England and Wales. He was dressed in velvet and silk before he could walk. He was surrounded by servants who bowed to him as my lord. He would have been raised with the consciousness that he was better than almost everyone else on earth. But the 15th century was a wheel of fortune that spun with terrifying speed. The golden age of the Staffords was about to crash into a wall of blood and betrayal. In 1483, when Edward was just 5 years old, the world broke. King Edward IV, his uncle, died suddenly. The throne passed to his young son Edward V, little Edward Stafford's cousin and playmate. But the realm was instantly plunged into chaos. The king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized control. He took the young king and his brother into custody in the Tower of London, declared them illegitimate, and crowned himself King Richard III. And who was standing right next to Richard III during this coup? Who was his right-hand man, his enforcer, his king-maker? It was Edward's father, the second Duke of Buckingham. For a few heady months in the summer of 1483, Edward's father was the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He was the pillar upon which Richard III's usurped throne rested. He was showered with rewards, titles, and lands. The future for 5-year-old Edward looked brighter than ever. He was the son of the kingmaker. But then, the second Duke did something that historians are still arguing about 500 years later. He switched sides. Why? Was it a crisis of conscience over the murder of the princes in the Tower? Was it thwarted ambition? Did he think he should be king? We don't know. But in the autumn of 1483, the Duke rebelled against the very man he had just helped crown. This was known as Buckingham's Rebellion. It was a disaster. The weather turned against them. Massive storms flooded the River Severn, preventing the Duke's Welsh army from crossing into England to join his allies. His soldiers, wet, hungry, and unpaid, deserted in droves. The rebellion dissolved before a single arrow was fired. The second Duke, the great gambler, found himself a fugitive. He went into hiding in Shropshire, disguised as a commoner seeking refuge with a retainer he had trusted. But the reward on his head was £1,000, a fortune. The retainer betrayed him. The Duke was dragged out of hiding and brought to Salisbury. There was no trial. Richard III was in no mood for mercy. On a gray Sunday in November 1483, in the marketplace of Salisbury, the second Duke of Buckingham was beheaded. This is the moment that must have defined the psychology of our protagonist, Edward Stafford. One day he is the pampered heir to the greatest estate in England, safe in his nursery at Brecon Castle. The next day news arrives that his father is dead, executed as a traitor. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Under the law of attainder, when a nobleman was executed for treason, his blood was declared corrupt. This meant he couldn't pass on titles or land. The vast Stafford fortune, the castles, the manors, the plate, the jewels, all of it was confiscated by the crown. Overnight, 5-year-old Edward Stafford became a penniless orphan. He was stripped of his title. He was no longer a duke. He was just the son of a traitor. But it was worse than that. He was now a target. Richard III was cleaning house, and the son of his greatest enemy was a loose end. We have incredible, almost cinematic accounts of what happened next. The Stafford household at Brecon panicked. The Duchess Catherine Woodville was frantic. She knew she had to get her son to safety before the king's men arrived. Little Edward was quickly shuffled out of his ancestral home. He was separated from his mother. To protect him from the king's wrath, he was taken deep into the English countryside, into the remote county of Herefordshire. For the next 2 years, the boy who would become the grandest peacock of the Tudor court lived in total obscurity. He was hidden by loyal gentry families, the Vaughans and the Canastons, who risked their lives to shelter him. Imagine the confusion of a 5-year-old boy. He is forced to live under assumed names. He is dressed in rough homespun cloth instead of silk. He is told he must never tell anyone who his father was. He moves from house to house, always looking over his shoulder, likely sensing the fear of the adults around him. He sleeps in strange beds, eats common food, and cries for a father he will barely remember and a mother he cannot see. This period from 1483 to 1485 was a trauma that etched itself into his soul. It taught him a lesson he would never forget. Power is fragile. The world is dangerous. One day you are a god, the next you are a fugitive. It also, paradoxically, must have bred a fierce, burning pride in him. Even as he ate his porridge in a simple manor house in Herefordshire, his guardians would have whispered to him who he really was. "You are a Stafford," they would have told him. "You are of the blood of kings. This is not your life. Your life is waiting for you." He spent those 2 years waiting for a Savior. And in August 1485, the Savior arrived. The news would have filtered slowly to the boy in hiding. A new challenger had landed in Wales. Henry Tudor, an improbable exile with a ragtag army, had met King Richard III at a place called Bosworth Field. Richard was dead, hacked down in the mud. Henry Tudor was king. For 7-year-old Edward, this was the miracle. Henry VII needed to heal the wounds of the Wars of the Roses. He needed to reconcile the warring factions, and one of the best ways to do that was to restore the victims of Richard III. The new king reversed the act of attainder. In a stroke of a quill, the pauper boy was once again His Grace, the Duke of Buckingham. His lands were restored. His titles were returned. He was one of the premier peers of the realm again. But Henry VII was a shrewd, calculating man, the first modern politician. He didn't just hand the boy his inheritance and wish him well. He knew that this boy, with his Plantagenet blood and his vast wealth, was a potential threat. He needed to be watched. He needed to be molded. Henry VII took Edward as a royal ward. This meant the king effectively adopted him. Edward was brought to London to live in the king's own household. It sounds benevolent, but it was a golden cage. The king controlled his estates, pocketing the massive income while Edward was a minor. The king controlled his education, and the king controlled his marriage. Edward was placed under the supervision of the most terrifying woman in England, Lady Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother. Margaret was a religious zealot, a brilliant political operator, and a woman of iron will. Under her stern tutelage, Edward received an education fit for a prince. He lived alongside the king's own children, Arthur and Henry. He grew up in the very center of power, but always as an outsider insider. He was of the family, but not in the family. He was the cousin who had a better claim to the throne than the king himself, a fact that everyone knew but no one dared to say. As he entered his teenage years, the trauma of his childhood hardened into a rigid, prickly arrogance. He was determined to reclaim the dignity of his house. He began to dress with aggressive extravagance. He obsessed over heraldry and his family tree. He was building armor around the frightened boy who had hidden in Herefordshire. By the time Henry VII died in 1509, Edward Stafford was 31 years old. He was cultured, he was proud, and he was ready. The old miserly king was dead. A new young golden king, Henry VIII, was ascending the throne. Edward looked at the young Henry VIII and saw not just a king, but a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior who shared his thirst for glory even if he was 13 years his junior. He believed his time had finally come. He believed the Staffords were about to rule England alongside the Tudors. He was wrong. He was walking into a buzzsaw. The spring of 1509 didn't just bring a new king, it brought a new world. The old king, Henry VII, had died in his bed at Richmond Palace, leaving behind a kingdom that was rich, stable, and utterly exhausted by his grim, penny-pinching paranoia. When the 18-year-old Henry VIII stepped out onto the balcony, it was as if the sun had come out after 24 years of winter. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, with hair like spun gold, and a face that radiated health and charisma. He was the most beautiful prince in Christendom. He loved hunting, he loved dancing, he loved war, and he loved spending money. For Edward Stafford, now the 31-year-old Duke of Buckingham, this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. If Henry VIII was the sun, Buckingham was the moon. reflecting the king's glory but possessing a gravity of his own. At the coronation in June 1509, Buckingham was the undisputed master of ceremonies. He served as the Lord High Constable of England, a position that gave him command over the army and the maintenance of the king's peace for the day. Imagine the scene inside Westminster Abbey. As the organ thundered and the incense swirled, it was Buckingham who walked just a step ahead of the king, carrying the crown. It was a visual confirmation of the hierarchy of England: God, the king, and then the Duke of Buckingham. In these early, heady days, the two men were thick as thieves. They were cousins, yes, and they were the two greatest athletes at court. They jousted together, hunted together, and dressed up in elaborate masks to surprise the queen. They spoke the same language of chivalric romance. They were both obsessed with the code of knighthood, honor, glory, and magnificence. But there was a subtle difference in how they viewed their roles. Henry played at being a king. Buckingham was a great lord. Henry's power was new and absolute. Buckingham's was ancient and feudal. Henry ruled by right of conquest. Buckingham ruled by right of blood. And while they feasted together, Buckingham was quietly amassing a fortune that would make even a modern billionaire blush. To understand why Buckingham was so dangerous, we have to look at his bank balance. In a world before industry, land was power, and Buckingham owned more of it than anyone else. His annual income was estimated at over £6,000. To the modern ear, that sounds like pocket change. But in 1510, a skilled carpenter earned about £6 a year. A gentleman could live comfortably on £50. Buckingham was earning the equivalent of 1,000 skilled lifetimes every single year. In modern purchasing power, this is hard to calculate, but think of it as an annual tax-free income of tens of millions of dollars. He owned 187 castles, manors, and lordships across England and Wales. He was the largest landowner in Staffordshire, Gloucestershire, Kent, and the Welsh Marches. If you walked from the Welsh border to London, you could likely sleep every night on land owned by the Duke of Buckingham. But in the Tudor mind, money wasn't for saving, it was for showing. This was the era of conspicuous consumption. Power had to be visible. If you didn't look rich, you weren't powerful. Buckingham took this to a pathological level. He was addicted to magnificence. We have his household accounts, and they read like a fever dream of luxury. For the wedding of Prince Arthur, Henry's brother, Buckingham commissioned a gown of needlework on cloth of gold. It was valued at £1,500. He was wearing the cost of 3 fully crewed warships on his back for a cocktail party. He didn't travel alone. When he went to London, he brought a household of 140 people, gentlemen, ushers, chaplains, musicians, cooks, and bodyguards. To feed them, his kitchen was an industrial operation, slaughtering whole herds of cattle and sheep every week. He was deeply pious. He founded a college at his manor in Thornbury, employing a full choir of men and boys just to sing masses for his soul. He went on pilgrimages to shrines across England, leaving trailing showers of gold coins for the poor. This wasn't just vanity, it was political theater. By spending this way, he was saying to the world, I am the Stafford. I am the pillar of the realm. Wealth was one thing, military power was another. And this is where the ice under Buckingham's feet began to crack. The Wars of the Roses had been fought by overmighty subjects, nobles who could raise their own private armies to challenge the king. Henry VII had spent his entire reign trying to ban this practice, known as livery and maintenance. He passed laws forbidding nobles from keeping private soldiers. Buckingham ignored these laws because his lands were largely in the Welsh Marches, the wild, lawless borderlands between England and Wales. He argued that he needed a standing force to keep the peace. As a marcher lord, he had the legal right to hold his own courts and execute his own justice. In his territory, the king's writ did not run. The duke's writ did. He maintained a massive affinity, a network of tenants, gentry, and retainers who wore his badge, the Stafford knot, and swore allegiance to him. In 1513, when Henry VIII decided to invade France in a glorious and expensive military adventure, he called on his nobles to provide troops. Most nobles scraped together a few dozen men. Buckingham showed up with 500 men. But these weren't a ragtag militia. These were professional soldiers, archers, and men-at-arms, dressed in the Stafford livery of scarlet and black. They were better equipped, better trained, and better led than the king's own guard. When Buckingham rode at the head of this column, glittering in armor, the king must have felt a cold shiver of recognition. This, he would have thought, is exactly how the Wars of the Roses started. If his army was a threat, his house was a provocation. In 1510, he obtained a license from the king to crenellate, fortify, his manor house at Thornbury in Gloucestershire. In the 16th century, noblemen were stopping the construction of castles. The country was supposed to be at peace. They were building comfortable, unfortified brick palaces with big glass windows, like Hampton Court. Buckingham bucked the trend. He began to build a dinosaur. Thornbury Castle was a stunning, confusing hybrid. On the inside, it was a Renaissance palace with lush gardens, orchards, and comfortable apartments. But on the outside, it was a medieval war machine. He built massive curtain walls designed to withstand artillery fire. He installed loops specifically designed for cannons and muskets, aiming out at the surrounding countryside. The front entrance was a towering fortress with a drawbridge and portcullis. Over the gate, he carved a defiant inscription. This gate was begun in the year of our Lord God, 1511, the second year of the reign of King Henry VIII, by me, Edward, Duke of Buckingham, Earl of Hereford, Stafford, and Northampton. Note the by me, not by the grace of the king. It was a statement of autonomy in stone. Why did a loyal duke need a cannon-proof fortress in the peaceful heart of Gloucestershire? Who was he planning to fight? The French were across the Channel. The Scots were in the north. The only potential enemy in Gloucestershire was the king's own army. While the bricks were rising at Thornbury, the relationship at court was crumbling. The first major rupture happened just a year into the new reign, and it revealed the dangerous pride of the Duke. It was an open secret that Henry VIII had a wandering eye. In 1510, rumors began to swirl that the king was having an affair with one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Anne Hastings. The problem? Anne Hastings was Buckingham's sister. In the cynical world of the court, most men would have been delighted. Having your sister in the king's bed was a fast track to promotion and profit. The Boleyns would later build an empire on it. The Seymours would do the same. But Edward Stafford was not most men. He was a man of the old school. He viewed the affair not as an opportunity, but as a stain on his family honor. The king was treating the Staffords like common whores. When Buckingham found out, he exploded. He didn't quietly ask the king to stop. He didn't try to manage the situation. Instead, he conspired with Anne's husband, Lord George Hastings, to catch the king in the act. One night, they burst into Anne's chambers. We don't know exactly what they found, whether the king was there or if they just found Anne compromisingly waiting. But the result was a nuclear explosion of court drama. Buckingham railed against his sister. He berated her for her loose morals. When the king found out he had been spied on and that his mistress was being harassed, he was apoplectic. He banished Anne's husband from court, but he couldn't banish Buckingham so easily. Buckingham, in a huff, took his sister and physically removed her from the court, dragging her off to a nunnery or a remote estate to cool her heels. This was a breathtaking act of insubordination. He had effectively told the king, "You cannot have her. She is a Stafford first, and your subject second." Henry VIII never forgot a slight. He forgave Buckingham eventually, allowing him back to court, but the dynamic had shifted. The king now saw Buckingham not just as a cousin, but as a scold, a rigid, moralizing, powerful man who thought he could police the king's pleasures. While Buckingham was fighting with the king over honor, a new enemy was rising from the shadows, an enemy who didn't care about honor, only power. Thomas Wolsey was everything Buckingham was not. Buckingham was born to the purple. Wolsey was the son of an Ipswich butcher or cattle dealer. Buckingham was a warrior. Wolsey was a priest. Buckingham was charming but arrogant. Wolsey was a workaholic genius who could out-administer an army of clerks. By 1515, Wolsey had risen to become Lord Chancellor and a cardinal of the church. He was the king's fixer. Henry VIII, who hated paperwork, happily handed the reins of government to Wolsey. To Buckingham, this was an abomination against nature. In his worldview, the king should be advised by his natural counselors, the great dukes and earls of the realm, men of blood, men of land, not a vile-blooded cleric who smelled of the slaughterhouse. Buckingham treated Wolsey with open contempt. He refused to show him the deference that his office required. And Wolsey, who was deeply insecure about his low birth, hated Buckingham for his easy arrogance. The tension came to a head in the famous basin incident. It was a ceremonial custom that the greatest peer present would hold a basin of water for the king to wash his hands before dining. One day Buckingham was performing this duty, holding the golden bowl and towel. The king washed his hands. Then Wolsey, presuming on his intimacy with the king, stepped forward and dipped his own hands into the same water while Buckingham was still holding the bowl. It was a shocker. It implied that Wolsey and the king were equals. It treated the Duke of Buckingham like a common servant holding a bucket. Buckingham didn't say a word. He simply tipped the basin. Water sloshed out, pouring all over Wolsey's expensive red cardinal shoes. The court froze. It was a moment of slapstick comedy, but the undertone was deadly. The king likely laughed. He loved a bit of roughhousing, but Wolsey turned crimson. The Venetian ambassador later reported that Wolsey muttered a threat under his breath. He would sit on Buckingham's skirts. In Tudor slang, to sit on someone's skirts meant to punish them, to drag them down. Buckingham, hearing the threat, supposedly went home, and the next day appeared at court wearing a short jacket with no skirts, tails, at all. When the king asked why he was dressed so oddly, Buckingham quipped that he was doing it so the cardinal could not sit on my skirts. It was a witty retort. It got a laugh, but it was the last laugh he would get. Buckingham had now made an enemy of the man who controlled the king's mind, and Wolsey began to keep a file. He began to listen to the whispers. He began to wait for the Duke to make a mistake. And the Duke, in his arrogance, was about to make a fatal one. He was about to start talking to a monk. Buckingham had made his point, but he had also marked himself. By humiliating the king's right-hand man and scolding the king himself, he had proven that he was a man who feared no one. But in the Tudor court, fearlessness was not a virtue, it was a liability. While Buckingham retreated to his fortress at Thornbury, feeling secure behind his stone walls and his private army, the ground beneath him was beginning to shift. He was looking for enemies on the battlefield, scanning the horizon for armies. He should have been looking much closer to home. The danger wasn't coming from a cannon, it was coming from the whispers in the dark and from a fatal curiosity about the future that would cost him everything. By 1518, the weather at the court of Henry VIII had begun to turn. The endless summer of the early reign, the jousts, the masks, the easy camaraderie, was chilling into something darker. The king was approaching 30. He was still magnificent, but he was becoming disappointed. His disappointment had a specific shape, the lack of a son. Queen Catherine of Aragon, for all her piety and noble blood, had failed in her one essential duty. She had given birth to a string of dead babies and one living daughter, Mary. To a Tudor mind, this wasn't just bad luck, it was a judgment from God. The dynasty was fragile. If Henry died tomorrow, the throne would be plunged into chaos. In this atmosphere of reproductive anxiety, the Duke of Buckingham represented Henry's deepest insecurity. While the king stared at an empty cradle, Buckingham stood tall with a healthy son and a lineage that rivaled the Tudors. To a paranoid Henry, Buckingham wasn't just a cousin. He was a living replacement waiting in the wings. Buckingham, blinded by his own grandeur, failed to read the room. He continued to act like a co-ruler rather than a subject. He grumbled about the cost of the court. He rolled his eyes at the new men rising in power. He was a man walking through a gunpowder factory with a lit torch, convinced that his noble blood made him fireproof. The final rupture between the old world of Buckingham and the new world of Henry VIII happened in France at the most extravagant party in European history, the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was June 1520. Henry VIII and King Francis I of France agreed to meet in a valley near Calais to sign a treaty of universal peace, but it wasn't really a peace treaty, it was a measuring contest. Both kings wanted to outshine the other. They built temporary palaces made of canvas and glass. They erected fountains that pumped free red wine for the soldiery. They wore outfits so encrusted with jewels that men could barely walk. Buckingham was contractually obligated to attend. As the premier peer of England, he had to be the centerpiece of the English delegation. But he hated it. He hated the French, a traditional English aristocratic prejudice. He hated the expense. He was forced to spend thousands of pounds outfitting his own retinue to match the king's standards, and he hated the vanity of it all. While Henry VIII was wrestling with the French king and dancing until dawn, Buckingham was on the sidelines, muttering. He was heard complaining loudly that the whole event was a masquerade and a waste of money. He called it pompous foolishness. Wolsey, who had organized the event, heard these complaints. He saw a man who wasn't just grumpy, he was disloyal. Buckingham wasn't playing the game. He was standing apart, judging the king. But while Buckingham was complaining about the cost of gold cloth, he was unaware that back in England, a far cheaper commodity was about to destroy him. A servant's grudge. Every great tragedy needs a Judas. For Edward Stafford, that man was Charles Knivet. Knivet was not a stranger. He was family. He was the Duke's cousin once removed. He had served as Buckingham's surveyor, managing his estates in Kent. He was a man who knew where the bodies were buried, literally and metaphorically. He knew the Duke's finances, his temper, and his secrets. But in 1519, the relationship soured. Buckingham, who could be a tyrannical employer, audited Knivet's books and accused him of embezzlement. He claimed Knivet had swindled tenants and pocketed the rents. Buckingham didn't just fire him, he destroyed him. He dismissed Knivet from his service in disgrace, sued him for the missing money, and cast him out into the cold. It was a fatal miscalculation. Buckingham assumed that Knivet was just a crushed ant. He forgot that a crushed ant with high-level clearance is a dangerous thing. Knivet was left destitute, angry, and desperate. He knew that there was one man in England who would pay a high price for dirt on the Duke of Buckingham. In late 1520, Knevet walked into the palace of Cardinal Wolsey. He didn't come to confess his own sins. He came to sell his master. What Knevet told Wolsey made the cardinal's eyes light up. He didn't talk about embezzlement or land disputes. He talked about treason. He told Wolsey about the Duke's secret addiction, prophecy. In the 16th century, the line between religion, magic, and treason was razor thin. Everyone believed in astrology and soothsayers, but for a man of royal blood to ask about the future of the king was a capital crime. To imagine the king's death was to commit treason. Knevet revealed that for years, Buckingham had been making secret visits to a remote Carthusian monastery called Hinton Priory near Bath. There he met with a monk named Father Nicholas Hopkins. Father Hopkins was a holy man with a reputation for clairvoyance. Buckingham had fallen under his spell. The Duke, starved for reassurance that his greatness was destined, listened to whatever the monk told him, and the monk told him what he wanted to hear. According to Knevet's testimony, the conversations went something like this. Buckingham would ask, "What of the king's issue?" The monk would go into a trance and reply, "The king shall have no male issue that shall live." This was dynamite. But the monk went further. He allegedly told Buckingham, "My lord, you should be of good comfort, for I see that you shall be the greatest man in the realm." And explicitly, after the king's life, the crown shall revert to you. Buckingham, flattered and perhaps deluded, paid the monk for these predictions. He gave the priory money. He gave the monk golden cups. He promised that when he was king, the priory would be richly rewarded. Wolsey sat back and looked at the evidence. In the strict legal sense, Buckingham hadn't done anything. He hadn't raised an army against the king. He hadn't plotted an assassination. He hadn't signed a treaty with a foreign power. All he had done was listen to a crazy monk and grumble to his cousin. But under the draconian treason laws of the Tudors, this was enough. Wolsey began to construct a legal theory known as constructive treason. The logic was terrifyingly simple. The monk said Henry would have no sons, and Buckingham would be king. Buckingham listened, agreed, and paid the monk. Therefore, Buckingham was waiting for the king to die. By waiting and preparing for the king to die, he was compassing, imagining, planning the king's death. Therefore, he was guilty of high treason. Wolsey needed more than just the monk, though. He needed to prove intent. He squeezed Knevet for more details. Knevet, realizing his life depended on the quality of his information, suddenly remembered more damaging conversations. He claimed that on one occasion, Buckingham had been so angry with Henry VIII, back during the scandal with his sister, that he had touched the hilt of his dagger and sworn that if he had been arrested, he would have done what his father intended to do to Richard III, meaning kill the king with his own hand. Was this true? Or was Knevet feeding Wolsey the exact soundbite he needed to secure a death warrant? We will never know. But it gave Wolsey the dagger he needed to stick in Buckingham's back. By the spring of 1521, the dossier was complete. Wolsey took it to Henry VIII. One can imagine the scene. The king, already frustrated by his lack of an heir, reading the transcripts of the monk's prophecies, reading that his own cousin, the man he had dined with, hunted with, and trusted, was secretly counting the days until he died, reading that the Duke saw himself as the rightful king. For Henry, this wasn't just legal treason. It was a personal betrayal of the deepest order. It confirmed every paranoid fear he had ever had about the old nobility. They were vultures, circling his dying dynasty. The king's reaction was cold and swift. "If he has done this," Henry reportedly said, "he shall lose his head." But they had to be careful. Buckingham was powerful. If he got wind of the arrest warrant while he was at Thornbury Castle, behind those cannon-proof walls, surrounded by his 500 soldiers, he might actually rebel. He might start a civil war. They needed to lure the lion out of his den. In April 1521, a polite summons arrived at Thornbury Castle. The king invited his right trusty and well-beloved cousin to London. There was no mention of treason, no mention of monks. It was framed as a routine invitation to court, perhaps to discuss the upcoming festivities for Easter. Buckingham, unsuspecting, took the bait. He set out from Thornbury with a small retinue. He left his army behind. He left his fortress behind. He rode toward London, believing he was going to a party. He was riding toward the block. As Buckingham traveled closer to London, the atmosphere began to change. He noticed that men were watching him. When he stopped at Windsor to dine, he found that his usual lodging was barred to him. When he tried to ride through the countryside, he noticed groups of the king's obsessionally loyal yeomen of the guard shadowing his party. The dread must have started to creep in. When he finally reached the banks of the Thames, ready to take his barge downriver to the palace, the trap was sprung. He was not met by a chaotic, welcoming party. He was met by the captain of the guard and a detachment of soldiers. They stepped onto his barge. The captain informed him with grim formality that he was under arrest for high treason. There was no fight. Buckingham was stunned. He demanded to see the king. "I will speak to my cousin," he surely demanded, but the king was unavailable. The barge did not turn toward the palace at Westminster. It turned east, slipping through the dark waters of the Thames, passing under the looming shadow of London Bridge. Ahead, the gray walls of the Tower of London rose out of the mist. The Traitor's Gate, the water entrance from which few ever returned, creaked open. The portcullis was raised just high enough for a barge to slip through. As the boat glided into the dark, damp tunnel of the fortress, the Duke of Buckingham must have realized the terrible truth. The prophecy was real. The monk had seen death. He just hadn't seen whose death it was. The Traitor's Gate closed behind him, sealing Edward Stafford into a world of stone and silence. The shock of the arrest was absolute. One moment he was the master of the Welsh marches, riding to a royal celebration. The next, he was a prisoner of the state, stripped of his dignity and his name. But Henry VIII wasn't satisfied with just locking his cousin away. He needed to make an example. He needed a public spectacle that would terrify the nobility into submission for a generation. And so the machinery of Tudor justice began to grind into motion. It wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to deliver a verdict. The trial of the century was about to begin. For 3 weeks, the most powerful noblemen in England sat in a stone room, listening to the drip of the Thames. The Tower of London in 1521 was not a museum. It was a functioning machine of state terror. For Edward Stafford, the transition from the velvet-draped halls of Thornbury to the cold, damp confinement of the Tower was a psychological shock designed to break him before he even stepped into the courtroom. He was cut off from the world. His vast affinity, that army of retainers and servants, had evaporated. His wife and children were under house arrest. His friends at court, the men who had feasted at his table for decades, were suddenly suffering from collective amnesia. No one wrote, no one visited. In the eyes of the court, he was already dead. His body just hadn't caught up yet. But inside the cell, Buckingham was not breaking. He was seething. He was a man convinced of his own innocence and his own importance. He believed, perhaps naively, that this was all a misunderstanding, a flare-up of the king's temper that could be smoothed over if he could just talk to Henry. He didn't realize that Henry didn't want to talk. Henry wanted a show. On the morning of May 13th, 1521, the stage was set in Westminster Hall. This was the grandest room in England, a cavernous space with a magnificent hammer beam roof, usually reserved for coronations and royal feasts. Today it was a slaughterhouse. The king was taking no chances with the optics. This had to look legal. It had to look like justice, not murder. Buckingham was entitled to be tried by his peers. A jury was assembled consisting of 17 of the highest-ranking men in England, 1 duke, 1 marquis, 7 earls, and 8 barons. But when Buckingham walked into the hall and looked at the faces of his peers, his heart must have sunk. It was a jury of the king's hand-picked loyalists. The Duke of Norfolk presided as the Lord High Steward. He was an old man, 80 years old, representing the old guard. He was the father-in-law of Buckingham's daughter. He was family. But he was also a man who knew that to save his own skin, he had to do the king's bidding. The Duke of Suffolk, Charles Brandon, was there. He was the king's best friend and brother-in-law, a man who owed everything to Henry. The Earl of Northumberland, Buckingham's own father-in-law, was absent, sick with grief, or perhaps conveniently ill to avoid condemning his own daughter's husband. Buckingham was led to the bar. He was dressed not in rags, but in his finery, a final act of defiance. He stood tall, looking down his nose at the men who were about to kill him. The proceedings began. The charges were read out. They were a mixture of the trivial, the mystical, and the damning. The Attorney General laid out the narrative Wolsey had constructed, the prophecies. The Duke had consulted the monk of Hinton, Nicholas Hopkins, on multiple occasions to ask how long the king would live. The ambition. The monk had told him he would be king, and the Duke had embraced this, giving the monk gifts. The threat. The Duke had stated that if the king died, he would chop off the head of Cardinal Wolsey and seize the government. The dagger. The Duke had once said that if he had been arrested in 1510, he would have stabbed the king. Then came the witnesses. They didn't bring the monk, Father Hopkins, into the hall. He was too unpredictable. Instead, they read his signed confession. The poor man, likely tortured or terrified into compliance, had admitted everything. But the star witness was Charles Knivet, the disgruntled cousin. Knivet took the stand and looked the Duke in the eye. He repeated the damaging stories, the conversations about the succession, the hatred of the king's advisers, the purchase of cloth of gold for the coronation, where Buckingham allegedly said he did it to allure the people to his cause. It was a devastating betrayal. Knivet twisted every grumble, every joke, every moment of frustration into a coherent plot to kill the king. Buckingham listened to this avalanche of lies. When it was his turn to speak, the court expected a broken man. They expected begging. Instead, they got a master class in rhetoric. Eyewitnesses report that the Duke defended himself with sorrowful eloquence. He didn't plead for mercy, he fought for his life. He attacked the witnesses. He pointed out the obvious flaw in the prosecution's case. Knivet was a fired employee. He was a man with a grudge. He was doing this for money and revenge. "This man is a knave," Buckingham thundered. "He is a perjurer who seeks my life to fill his purse." He dismissed the monk. He admitted to seeing the monk, he was a pious man after all, but denied the treasonous context. He argued that listening to a delusion was not the same as plotting a murder. He denied the intent. He challenged the legal theory. Where was the weapon? Where was the army? Where was the plot? All they had were words spoken in private, table talk, as he called it. Since when was grumbling about the king a capital crime? For a moment, the air in Westminster Hall shifted. The sheer force of Buckingham's personality, his logic, and his obvious nobility seemed to sway the room. The peers looked uncomfortable. They knew deep down that he was right. He hadn't done anything. If this had been a fair trial, he might have walked free. But the peers weren't looking at the evidence. They were looking at the empty chair where the king would sit. They knew what Henry wanted. They knew that if they acquitted Buckingham, the king's wrath would turn on them. The jury retired to consider their verdict. It didn't take long. When the peers returned, the silence in the hall was heavy enough to crush a man. One by one, the Lord High Steward called upon them. "My Lord of Suffolk, how say you? Is the prisoner guilty of these treasons or not?" Charles Brandon, the king's friend, stood up. He placed his hand over his heart. "Guilty," he said. "My Lord of Dorset?" "Guilty." "My Lord of Essex?" "Guilty." 17 times the question was asked. 17 times the answer was the same. The verdict was unanimous. The peers had closed ranks. The pack had turned on its leader. The final act was the most heartbreaking. It fell to the Duke of Norfolk, the presiding judge, the old warrior, the father of the woman married to Buckingham's heir, to pass the sentence. Norfolk stood up. He looked at the man he had known since he was a boy. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Tears began to stream down his face. The old man wept openly, his shoulders shaking. Buckingham, the man about to die, watched him with a strange calm. Finally, choking back sobs, Norfolk managed to get the words out. He recited the horrific traditional formula for traitors. "You are to be led back to the Tower, and from there laid on a hurdle and drawn through the city to Tyburn, there to be hanged, cut down while you are yet alive, your bowels taken out and improper parts cut off and burned before your face, your head cut off, your body divided into 4 quarters, and your head and quarters to be set up where the king shall assign, and may God have mercy on your soul." It was a sentence of unimaginable brutality, but Buckingham remained stoic. He looked at the weeping judge and delivered one of the great speeches of the Tudor age. His voice was clear and steady. "My Lord of Norfolk, you have said as a traitor should be said unto, but I was never none. But, my lords, I nothing malign for that you have done to me, but the eternal God forgive you my death, and I do. I shall never sue to the king for life, howbeit he is a gracious prince, and more grace may come from him than I desire. And so I desire you, my lords, and all my fellows to pray for me." It was a devastating rebuke wrapped in forgiveness. He forgave them, making them feel their guilt even more. He asserted his innocence. "I was never none." And he delivered the ultimate aristocratic insult to Henry VIII. He refused to beg. He would not give his cousin the satisfaction of seeing him crawl. He called the king gracious with an irony that surely cut deep. Buckingham was marched back to the barge. The axe was now turned with the blade facing towards him, the symbol that he was a condemned man. When Henry VIII heard the news, he showed a flicker of what passed for mercy in his soul. Perhaps moved by the "gracious prince" comment, or perhaps just wanting to avoid the messy, butchering spectacle of quartering his own cousin, Henry commuted the sentence. Buckingham would not be hanged or disemboweled. He would be beheaded. It was the privilege of his rank. The date was set for Friday, May 17th, 1521. Buckingham had 4 days to prepare his soul. In the Tower, he refused to see his wife or children. Perhaps it was too painful. Perhaps he wanted to spare them the sight of him in his final hours. He spent his time in prayer. He was done with the world. He was ready to leave the stage. Friday, May 17th, 1521. The morning dawned bright and clear over London, a cruel contrast to the grim business at hand. Inside the Tower, Edward Stafford made his final preparations. He had spent his last night not in frantic bargaining, but in quiet prayer. He had taken the sacrament. He had made peace with his God. Now he had to face the crowd. At roughly 11 a.m., the lieutenant of the Tower arrived at his cell. The time had come. Buckingham stepped out into the daylight. He was dressed simply now, likely in a black velvet gown. The days of cloth of gold and peacock feathers were over, but even in this somber attire, witnesses noted that he retained his princely carriage. He walked not like a criminal shuffling to his doom, but like a monarch processing to a ceremony. He was led out of the Tower gates and on to Tower Hill. The scene that greeted him was a sea of faces. The chroniclers say the crowd was marvelous great. The citizens of London had turned out in their thousands, but there was no cheering. The mood was one of shock. They were watching the fall of a Titan, and the silence was heavy with the realization that if the Duke of Buckingham could die, no one was safe. The scaffold was draped in black serge. A block stood in the center, surrounded by straw to soak up the royal blood. The executioner, a man whose face was likely covered, waited with the axe. Buckingham climbed the steps. He looked out over the city he had once dominated. He saw the spires of the churches where he had paid for masses. He saw the river where his barges had once floated in triumph. He turned to the crowd to speak. In Tudor executions, the condemned were expected to give a good end, to confess their guilt, praise the king's justice, and warn the crowd to obey the law. It was a final act of propaganda for the state. Buckingham, true to his character, refused to follow the script. He did not confess. He did not admit to treason. Instead, he simply asked the people to pray for him. He said, "I have offended the king's grace through negligence and lack of grace, and I ask his forgiveness. But I am innocent of treason." He then turned to the executioner. The man, as was custom, knelt and asked the Duke's forgiveness for what he was about to do. Buckingham granted it instantly. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a handful of gold angels, coins, giving them to the headsman. Even in death, he was the generous lord, tipping the servant who served him. He removed his gown and doublet, standing in his fine white shirt. The officials moved to bind his hands with rope. Buckingham pulled back. He flashed a look of defiance. "I shall not be bound," he declared. "I will die a free man." The officials, awed by his presence, stepped back. He would die unbound. He knelt at the block. He placed his neck on the wood. He whispered a final prayer in Latin, commending his spirit to the hands of Christ. He gave the signal, perhaps spreading his arms or dropping a handkerchief. The axe fell. In a brutal instant, the head of the Duke of Buckingham was severed from his body. The executioner lifted it up, crying, "Behold the head of a traitor!" But the crowd did not cheer. Many wept. They knew they had just watched the murder of the last great Englishman of the old age. The body was not quartered. The monks of the Austin Friars, a nearby religious house that Buckingham had supported, came forward. They took the head and the body, washed the blood away, and buried him in their church. There was no state funeral. The golden Titan was gone in an afternoon. But for his family, the nightmare was just beginning. Immediately after the execution, Parliament passed a formal act of attainder. This was a legal weapon of mass destruction. It declared that Edward Stafford was a traitor, and therefore his blood was corrupted. This meant disinheritance. His son, Henry Stafford, did not become the fourth Duke. The title was extinguished. The boy was stripped of his rank and became a commoner. Confiscation. Every acre of land, every castle, every gold cup, every tapestry was seized by the crown. The Stafford fortune, the millions of pounds, the 187 estates, vanished into the king's pocket. The Staffords, who had been the second family of England, were reduced to poverty. His son was eventually given a tiny fraction of the lands back, but the grandeur was gone forever. The House of Stafford never recovered its former glory. There is a chilling postscript to this story that perfectly illustrates the coldness of Henry VIII. Years later, during the royal progress of 1535, Henry VIII and his doomed queen, Anne Boleyn, went on a summer progress. They needed a place to stay in Gloucestershire. They chose Thornbury Castle. The king and his mistress walked through the halls that Buckingham had built. They slept in the bedchambers he had decorated. They looked out through the gun loops he had designed to defend himself. They treated the dead duke's dream home as their own holiday rental. Henry even spent money finishing some of the construction that Buckingham had started. He liked the castle. He just didn't like the man who built it. It was the ultimate act of erasure, occupying the dead man's shell while erasing his memory. So, why did Edward Stafford have to die? It is too easy to blame the malice of Cardinal Wolsey, though he certainly helped grease the wheels. It is too easy to blame the betrayal of Nivet. The uncomfortable truth lies with Henry VIII himself. Buckingham was the casualty of a collision between two eras. He was the last great feudal magnate, a relic of the 15th century who believed his power was independent of the crown. But Henry VIII was forging a new, terrifying absolutism. In this new world, there was no room for partners, only subjects. The medieval age was dying, and Henry simply hastened its end with the swing of an axe. The tall poppies had been warned. The age of the barons was over. The age of the tyrant had begun. Perhaps the most poignant summary of his life comes from a contemporary chronicler who noted the devastating irony of his downfall. Edward Stafford had everything. He had the blood of kings. He had gold enough to pave the streets. He had castles that could withstand cannons. He was the most magnificent creature in the Tudor jungle. And yet he was brought low, not by a great battle, not by a clash of armies, but by gossip, by table talk, by the whispers of a fired servant, and the mumblings of a confusing mystic. As the chronicler famously wrote, summing up the tragedy in one brutal sentence, he was the richest man in England, who died because he listened to a poor monk.